Hi, and welcome back to the channel. So I've received a request, or rather the channel has received a request, which I'm going to answer, to talk about what we think about historical European martial arts, HEMA, applied to modern self-defense situations. Is HEMA any good for modern self-defense? Is it partially good? Are there things that we can take from it? Or is it just not worth your bother if that's what you're interested in? So in this video, I'm going to hopefully unpack some of those ideas. So first of all, really, we have to define what is modern self-defense. That really varies from person to person and from culture to culture. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, modern self-defense means that you are unarmed, or maybe you have access to a weapon of improvisation, but generally speaking, the assumption is that you are completely unarmed up against someone who is either also unarmed or is possibly armed with something like a knife or a screwdriver or a bottle or an impact weapon. Whereas in maybe somewhere like the United States, it might be that actually self-defense for you entails being in a gunfight, possibly being in a gunfight. Or in some South American countries, it might be, it might be a knife fight or a machete fight, for example. Or in certain African countries, you might legitimately expect to get into a stick fight to defend yourself. So we have to be kind of careful when we talk about modern self-defense to actually nail our colours to the mast and say what context we're thinking of. So I'm going to be addressing this in a pretty much Western European kind of context where the assumption is basically that you are unarmed up against someone who is either also unarmed or carrying something like a knife or an improvised weapon. So that's the premise. That is how I'm interpreting modern self-defense. So now that we've got that term sorted out, we then have to look at what do you actually mean by HEMA? Do you mean all of HEMA in its entirety, from I-33 all the way up to wherever you choose to believe HEMA ends? Like Defendo and Fairbairn Sykes and that sort of lot, 1945. What do you mean? HEMA's a broad church, and different aspects of HEMA will be more suitable to the definition of modern day self-defense that I've given than others will be. Although I think it is important to mention that actually, in terms of modern day self-defense, being physically fit, and obviously doing a sport like HEMA will improve your general physical fitness, being physically fit is a definite advantage. So even if, but I mean by that measure, sort of playing football or tennis or rugby or just going running regularly would be as useful. But I do think physical fitness is an important part of any sort of self-defense package. So, and HEMA does deliver that. So that's an important part of it. But then, so when people talk about using HEMA for modern day self-defense, what they're almost always asking about really is medieval and Renaissance dagger combat. Is that translatable to modern self-defense against someone who, if they're a criminal or maybe a terrorist or someone like that, they're probably going to be armed with a knife. In most Western countries, particularly somewhere like the UK, where it's very, very difficult to get hold of firearms. So the answer is sort of yes and no. Probably a little bit more no than yes, I would say personally. And of course, these are personal opinions. But essentially, the two problem, well, there are three issues that I find with taking historical self-defense techniques and applying them to a modern day setting. The first is the weapon itself. These techniques are generally meant to be used against a longer dagger, whether that's something like a main gauche or from the later Renaissance sources, a parrying dagger, or whether that's a rondel or a bollock knife or something like that from the earlier sources. They generally tend to be used against a weapon with a pretty substantial blade on it, and that changes the fight. That changes how you would do certain techniques. Now, that's not to say that big blades aren't used in, modern knife crime. They absolutely are. But generally speaking, knives are going to be slightly smaller than, or substantially smaller in some cases, than what you find in the historical sources. You're probably looking at something typically with about a 5 or so inch blade, as opposed to 10 plus. And that does change the game. The second main difference between historical knife defense sources and modern day stuff is that in the historical sources there is generally an assumption that you are also carrying a weapon, at least a knife, or a dagger, possibly a sword, possibly an axe, whatever. But there is an assumption that you are yourself armed, and so a lot of the techniques involve blocking the initial attack in whatever manner, and giving yourself enough time while you've made that defensive action, while you've made that block, to then get to your own weapon and deploy that again, whether that's a dagger, a sword, whether in later sources maybe a pistol. But there is the assumption that you are armed, and that essentially your whole defense revolves around giving yourself enough time to survive the initial attack, the first bit of the encounter, and then to deploy your own weapon. So in many ways, there's a lot of similarities between that and something that you would perhaps see today in, particularly places like the United States, where you have a lot of defensive use of firearms courses, and you have weapons retention skills, and it's all about sort of creating space between you and your opponent to deploy your pistol, or defending yourself from that knife and then getting the pistol up, and sort of indexing it onto your opponent, and putting lead down range, as I'm sure they'd say. But obviously, to the definition that I've given for modern day self-defense, i.e., where you are unarmed, that's not particularly helpful, because you've got no weapon to deploy. So your game has to be about either getting that weapon off them and then maybe using it yourself, but then that leads us into the third point, which I'll get to in a minute, or incapacitating them somehow with strikes or so, and making your escape. So that's the sort of end game for the techniques, are two very different places, and that's something that you need to consider. And the third point that I referenced just a minute ago is actually the general legality and morality involved in the techniques. And this is something that you see in a lot of martial arts, is that they come from a time and place where the moral and legal codes were very different to today. A lot of them come from warrior cultures. They're designed to be used primarily in war, and what happens on the battlefield is governed by completely different rules to what you can do on the street. So just taking these techniques without regard for the modern legal code and modern legal context is asking for trouble, really. I know there's that famous American saying, so it sounds like I'm bashing on Americans. I'm not. I love Americans, but there's this they have this saying, which is, I'd rather be sort of judged by 12 than carried by 6. And you think, well, fundamentally yes, but it's not that great having successfully defended yourself, but with exponentially unacceptable force for our modern day civilian environment, to then to have successfully defended yourself and then to be sent to prison for potentially a very long time. So you're away from your friends, away from your family. You can't support them any longer, and you're in amongst the type of people that constitute the person that attacked you. So you've actually gone from out of the frying pan into the fire. So people can come out with these quips all they like, and there is an element of truth to it. Fundamentally, yes, you would rather take your chances with a jury than be dead. But that, just using that as a blanket, oh well, I'll just do whatever I have to survive, doesn't take into account the legal reality of this day and age. So that's an important point to consider, and that doesn't just apply to HEMA. That applies to lots of things. It can apply to modern martial arts, something like Krav Maga, as much as it does to HEMA. Or Filipino martial arts, for example. I mean, I love both Krav Maga and Filipino martial arts, but there's a lot of techniques they do there, which I mean, if you did that and it was caught on camera, there's a lot of hitting him multiple times when he's down, or doing multiple cuts and slashes and things, to an opponent, cutting the arm and then cutting the wrist and the arm and then the leg and the neck and everything. If you were caught doing that successfully on camera, I think that would probably go down pretty badly in court, as opposed to hitting a couple of times and then running once he's dropped, or doing like a classic defanging the snake, and then just pegging it off in the opposite direction. And that assumes, of course, that you can run. There are multiple reasons why you might not be able to run. For example, if you were, if you were physically blocked from running, obviously, if you're backed into an actual corner and the only way to get out of there is to go through somebody, then that's a different scenario. Or if you've got someone there who's dependent on you, so maybe a child, maybe someone who's got a physical disability, someone who's pregnant, they're not going to be able to run in the same way that two physically fit people would be able to run. So there are considerations, but the point that I'm making, that was a bit of waffle there. The point I'm making is that you have to apply modern morality to your training, and that may mean altering historical techniques to fit modern sensibilities. And so at that point, is it still HEMA? Is it still FMA? Is it still Krav Maga? I don't know. That's just, but this isn't. I'm not doing this video as a definitive. This is the answer 100%. Really, this is just me, talking because I've been asked to talk. Really. So that's one point. The other point I would like to make about HEMA is actually that when people talk about HEMA for self-defense, they talk about mainly Renaissance and medieval knife and dagger work. Whereas I think actually the more applicable HEMA stuff to modern self-defense is actually the stuff that you get in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So things like défense dans la rue, French defense in the street, French street fighting, essentially, which is a mix of boxe française, which sort of savate, boxe anglaise, pugilism, boxing. Latterly, they introduced elements of judo and jiu-jitsu into it, and there was also cane work and lots of other weapon work, so knife work, pistol work, things like that. So again, maybe the weapon stuff maybe not so relevant, but certainly the unarmed stuff very relevant. So you've got stuff like by Émile André, you've got Georges Dubois, you've got the Bartitsu stuff by Edward William Barton Wright, you've got Colonel Thomas Hoyer Monstry's self-defense for ladies and gentlemen. There's a lot of really fantastic stuff. Now, not all of it agrees with the corpus of the general opinion of modern day sort of combatives. I don't know. I don't like the term reality-based martial arts, but you know what I mean. That sort of a body of thinking within the modern self-defense community. Not all of it sticks with that. But I would say that was probably more appropriate. If you wanted a HEMA source to work from for modern self-defense, that is what I would choose. And that, in fact, is what I have chosen. That's what I use, or that's what Sam and I use in the club. Essentially, when we're teaching shore leave, we teach essentially from the Défense dans la Rue manuals, and the sprinkling of Bartitsu, sprinkling of classical jiu-jitsu, sprinkling of classic pugilism. That being said, when I am teaching knife defense, I will always teach the most modern and up-to-date stuff, because I think it's important that if people are studying something that they might end up feasibly using for real, I mean, no one's ever going to be in a, no one's going to challenge me to a sword fight. I'm never going to be in a fight for my life with a saber or a small sword. But I mean, I hope not. But it's feasible, touch wood, it doesn't happen, but it's feasible that I might end up fighting for my life unarmed against a knife. So, HEMA is my hobby. I love it. It's a passion, but I also want to live. So when it comes to studying stuff for self-defense and teaching stuff for self-defense, I always use the most up-to-date things. So that's really in a nutshell how I come down to it. Really is, if you're 100% that you want a HEMA source to study for modern self-defense, given the definition that I gave at the beginning of the video, then I would go with late 19th, early 20th century self-defense texts, either from the Bartitsu or Défense dans la Rue tradition. Something like that would be fine. But I would say, if you want something that is going to be effective in the 21st century on the streets of modern cities, then actually you should probably study modern stuff. It's a case of horses for courses, really. If that's what you're interested in and that's what you want, and study that. And the important thing to say is it doesn't have to be an and or. No, that sounds wrong. It doesn't have to be a case of, you study HEMA self-defense or you study modern self-defense. Absolutely not. I do both. Get the best of both worlds. So yeah, I don't know. That's my conclusion. I've shot my bolt now. My conclusion is, if you want modern self-defense, learn modern self-defense. If you want HEMA, learn HEMA. Just understand that it's horses for courses, and HEMA stuff has limitations when it comes to modern self-defense, particularly because it's mostly weapon orientated. So there we are. That's my conclusion. Have fun with your practice, with what you do, and enjoy yourselves and stay safe out there. If you want more videos on modern knife defense, let me know. If you want more videos on historical, self-defense, 19th century stuff that we teach as shore leave, then please let me know. If there's any other subjects that you'd like me to talk about, or you'd like Sam to talk about, we have slightly different areas of expertise, then please do drop us a message, and we'd be delighted to make those videos. It's always much nicer to make a video knowing that that's what someone wants, rather than just putting out some ramblings. So thank you very much for the person that asked for this video, and I will not tap the table because that makes the laptop shake. And I will see you in the next video. Hopefully soon we'll be out of quarantine so we can get some sparring videos up for you again. All right, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.